All right, everybody. Welcome to Plan 605 special session with Rebecca Torsell, Drawings and Documents Archive Director. Rebecca is a historic preservationist and archivist. She runs our Drawings and Documents Archive on the main floor of the College of Architecture and Planning. Rebecca is going to share with us today some wonderful insights on the world of Sanborn Fire Insurance Maps and how they teach us about what was in our built environment in previous years. And also some insights in terms of how those maps have informed what is there today. Sanborn Insurance Maps have a wonderful history and have a great influence in terms of how we do land use mapping today. So we're looking forward to this. Thank you, Rebecca, for joining us and for sharing these resources with us today. Thank you.
Very welcome, and I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy to share this information. So. Right. Yeah, do you want me to go ahead and start the presentation?
Please do, yes, thank you.
Okay, my host needs to enable screen sharing.
Oh, he does, oh yeah, he does, yes. All right, there we go. Okay, multiple participants.
There we go.
Yep, great, thank you.
Okay, so we're gonna get started. Lauren did an excellent job of describing my background, and so I have used these maps extensively when I've written architectural community surveys. I would have to say, in my experience in this field and in the field of documentation, these are probably the #1 resource that has the most information on it that can pivot and assist you with utilizing other resources that can ensure the accuracy of the other information that you're using. Like, say, for example, historic directories, it confirms the address, it confirms the use. It's just an amazing pivot point for you to have a visual. So as Lauren said before, Sanborn Fire Insurance Maps have a wonderful history. I think it's important to know why they were created. Just like their title is, they were created for the purposes of insurance underwriters to establish the risk for a particular building in an area for what it might be should there be a fire, really. So they were going to be looking at the building's materials. They were going to be looking at the number of stories, maybe where the windows were, what were the fire services in that area, how close it was to other buildings. All of these factors help them to do insurance underwriting. So let's go ahead and get into these. These are highly detailed maps. They depict commercial, industrial, and residential sections of urbanized areas. So what that means is if you are looking for a country house or perhaps a farm, you are probably not going to find that these maps have documented that area. They were very expensive to make. They were time consuming to make. So what they focused on was the areas that were built up the most. What you might actually find is if you're doing research in a certain area, you might find that in one map year, that area is not documented. And then you just flip ahead a few years, and as that area grew, if it grew enough and was considered significant enough, it would warrant then having it documented by way of the Sanborn maps. So these were published in volumes, 19th and 20th century. The Sanborn Map Company is still around today, though they do not create maps such as this, though they are more into the digital age. Because of that reason, there is copyright on these. Always keep copyright in mind when you're going to use any resource, primary or secondary, and know how to cite it. It's okay to use these things. You just have to make sure you cite it, especially when the company that published them is still in business. Anything before 1925, after 1925, you might have a hard time finding a digital version of it because of the copyright laws. The last Sanborn in Indiana was published in 1977. So let's talk about what kind of information these maps can give you. if you are in planning, you're probably going to be looking more at the historic context of a bigger area, not necessarily an individual building. And in that sense, these are amazing. They're amazing either way, but they're going to basically show you and identify where the first buildings were located. Oftentimes, specifically Midwest, but not necessarily Midwest, really anywhere, you're going to find that that's going to usually be next to a water source. So always keep that in mind as you're trying to understand why did it begin there. We know that water sources, by the way, little fun fact, typically 3 reasons why settlements began there. Those 3 reasons are going to be for energy, transportation, and waste disposal. They will give you street patterns, which are going to be excellent in helping you to understand the context of the development of your area. With the traffic, where was it going? Were there railway lines there, streetcar lines? Rivers and other geological features, also very influential to the settlement patterns, especially the early settlement patterns. Landmarks, residences, business, street widths. Keep in mind, these maps are actually drawn to scale. I believe it's 1:50, so you can find out a lot of information. Alleys and sidewalks even, and it will give you early population statistics and fire protection services in the infrastructure, because they really wanted to know if there was a fire, what kind of fire power do we have to basically combat that. And then if you're looking for an individual building, which depending on where you end up going in your field, this is going to actually give you the footprint of an individual building drawn to scale, roof lines sometimes. Tell you what the material is it a wood frame building, masonry, stone, fireproof, street numbers, dates of constructions, how you get a range. You look at a map, I don't see my building there. You look at the next map, X number of years later, the building is there. Sometime between those 2 map years, your building was constructed. That's immediate information that you can't get that anywhere else. It's just immediate. Subdivisions, those can be helpful if you're doing chain of title. Additions and alterations, I see my house. A few years later, there's a section added onto the back, probably a kitchen addition. Number of stories and the use. So these provide so much information with just really a picture, a highly detailed picture. So the keys to understanding Sanborn maps are actually the keys if you've ever read any map trying to go somewhere, you know that you need to understand what the symbols are or the color coding is by looking at the keys. The earliest of the Sanborn maps have fairly simple keys. Some of the earliest only have maybe 5 symbols on them. And as they progress through time, they get more and more comprehensive and more detailed. So the key that you see on the right-hand side of the screen here is actually an older map, from an older map. And you'll see that the pink actually means that it's a brick building. The yellow means that it's wood frame. And the blue means that it's stone, and brown means that it's fireproof. One interesting symbol you should take a look at is the rectangle that has the cross in it, the X, the diagonal. That's a stable. You will find that transportation has a grave impact on the way things look and looked in the past. Because we had to make room for the automobile, a lot of things changed. And also note that any person who usually had a house at that time in the past had to have a horse, so you're usually going to find always a stable in the backyard. So you're going to see this quite frequently on the older maps. Yeah. And then just one thing to point out is down below, the window openings will actually be designated on some buildings that are more extensive. And a single hash mark typically means that it's on 1 story, double hash mark, 2nd floor. So again, just highly detailed maps. And then if you look over on the left, you're going to see that Sanborn map legend is highly extensive because it's for a later map, and they get very, very complicated. From my experience, I've usually seen that most maps are fairly consistent with their keys and their symbols, but it's always a good idea to try to use the key that comes with your map, just to make sure that what you're looking at and how you're interpreting it is accurate. I do recommend trying to get color copies of the maps. We do have a subscription to ProQuest, which I'll go into later, that can give you Ohio maps and Kentucky maps. These are excellent. The only problem is they're all in black and white, which if you're trying to maybe interpret what the building materials are, can make it extremely difficult for you. So if you can get a color map, that's always the preferred one. So let's just take a quick look at the title page of a Sanborn map. This is an older map. As maps grow and cities grow and become more comprehensive, the title pages take up more than one page themselves, and they cannot really fit the entire city for a concept of an overview on any one page. They'll be divided up into multiple pages. But it'll tell you where the city, the county, the state is. It'll show you what map year it is. And it really just kind of zooms out on the early map. So you can clearly see that Muncie in 1892 was primarily developing towards the north, up towards the river. And then it was the areas that you see are documented are indicative of where the majority of the growth was taking place, right? So immediately, just looking at this 1892 map, you can see where the activity was that was going on in Muncie. I'm going to go in with you for what street index and special indexes are. These are awesome, just to try to get an idea of what your socioeconomic drivers are. Basically, it's going to list every business that's prominent and religions as well, to give you a feel for who was residing in your area and where they probably were working, or what was driving, what basically was employing people there. And that's just excellent for understanding the drivers of your area. The reports on fire protection services, you can actually see this down in the bottom right corner where it says population 20,000. If you kind of go into a little bit more detail, we'll talk about water facilities and the fire department. It will give you usually the scale, and then the sheet number and the graphic index. So sheet numbers and graphic indexes are very important to helping you to understand where to find the picture of the area that you want to document. So if you actually look here on the map, you're going to see that there is a yellow square that has a 2 on it. So basically, if I am interested in any portion of this yellow area, I need to go to sheet number 2 to be able to view it, to see how that area was detailed. Now, if I want to document or see if there's anything that's on this area just to the left of the yellow square of 2, you're not going to find anything. If it's not color coded, it hasn't been documented. Now, that doesn't mean that you're at a complete loss. You just need to flip to the next few map years for the next one that there is. They are not consistent. It wasn't every year necessarily. It wasn't even every 10 years. It was just when the economic activity warranted, you know, a redocumentation of that area. So don't give up if your area is not documented. Just flip ahead to the next map year. And if you can't find it on that one, just go forward again, and eventually your area is probably going to be built up enough that you're going to be able to see it.
Yeah. For instance, I live just to the west of number 4, sheet 4 there, but the house wasn't built until 1910. So, but it does appear on the next set. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's great. Yeah, exactly. Now, you know, when you lose that documentation and maybe your area just doesn't get built up enough, then you have a little bit more guesswork. You might not be able to get your range of construction because you can't confirm if it was there or not between a certain set of years. But it's still, like I said, these maps provide just so much information. I think one of the most important things too to getting that is there's really no pictures. I mean, there's very few, if any, pictures or visuals of the built environment during this time. These actually give it to you. And that's just so rare to have that opportunity to be able to see what was there, because a lot of times you might find values in the tax records as though there is a building there, but it might not be the existing structure that is there today.
Right.
These are the only items that really help you to confirm that you've got like a false negative number that is not your building. So yeah, moving on here, that's just a little bit of a close-up of the graphic numbers in the sheets, the population statistics, and for the indexes that can be extremely helpful. Street indexes are really helpful too, because if you say, well, I know I'm somewhere in this vicinity, but I'm not exactly sure, it will show you the street names, the range for the block numbers, and you can just go to that sheet and see if you can find what you're looking for. So here's the close-up of the reports on fire protection services and infrastructure. You know, take a look at the 1911 Muncie and the 1898 Indianapolis. And what you're going to find is that even though one is 13 years later than the other, that it's much smaller because Muncie was much smaller. So there was less maybe to report on the fire protection and the services. I'd say for your purposes, it's helpful to read just so that you can understand the capabilities maybe of what the city was like at that time. But probably the number one piece of information you're going to get from these is the population number at that. And here's just a close-up of the street indexes and the special indexes. On the left is a street index. So that's going to be helpful when you know it's somewhere in that street. I'm not really sure where it is. Well, if I know that if it's maybe somewhere in the 100 block of North Davidson Street, I know that I can go to sheet number 156 and 155 and probably find it. Where the specials on the right-hand side are excellent because they're basically telling you anything that was prominent in terms of businesses, religious affairs, and even accommodations for hotels. It just tells you exactly where all that activity was happening and what was driving the economics. This is just a close-up of the graphic index that we've already gone into detail of. The reason I put this slide in there because I want you to take a look at the sixes down at the bottom of the map. You're going to find that, you know, when they documented in the past, they really wanted to maximize the amount of content that was on an individual sheet. But sometimes an area doesn't develop in the form of a sheet. You know, it develops the way that it wants to. And in this case, what we're looking at with the sixes, especially the sixth block that's on the lower left, is primarily industry. The reason I know that is because you can see the railroad cars going right through it. They didn't usually do that for residential properties, and industries were usually positioned towards the outskirts of the cities, especially before, as their energy source switched from water to coal, they became extremely smelly and obnoxious. Yeah. They were always pushed to the outskirts. And what's indicative too is just looking at the railroad lines. And I can also go to sheet number 6 and take a better, you know, a more up close view of this. But because sheet number 6 on the left, they really was in a regular shape, but they wanted to get that area just to the right of it over to the northeast. Yeah, they basically would do this. They would take the irregular shape, they would document on a sheet, and then they would insert the smaller section, as you can see with this border around it. Yeah. So if you ever get to a sheet where you're like, what? You know, you don't understand the context for the settlement and what is that one area doing in there. Those buildings don't belong. When you look at the main map, you're actually just going to find that it's an inset like that. So just something to be aware of if you see something like that. They're taking two different sections and merging them together to maximize the content on a single sheet. So taking a look here at Muncie, this is, you know, one of the older maps. This is 1883. We talked before that Muncie's growth began up by the city. Keep an eye out for things like courthouse squares, which I've circled here in the pink block number 2, and kind of think about what this tells you about the growth patterns as we go through this. So one thing to take a look at here is these overviews, these title pages that we see that in the earlier maps give you a complete overview of an entire city. On the left is 1889 Muncie. There are 7 sheets of documentation for that map. 3 years later, 1902, there's over 37 on this map. 3 years, what happened? And don't just ask yourself on a local scale. That's very important to truly understanding it, but begin to zoom out and look on a national level. What was going on as the country as a whole, and then how was that reflected and impacted through the city of Muncie. So usually during this time, if we're live, I always ask, does anybody know what could have been going on to promote this kind of growth for this short time period? And the answer is going to be the Industrial Revolution, including a gas boom that happened here in Muncie as well. Right. So those were big drivers.
Plus the railroad.
Yes, plus the railroad. And you can see so clearly where the concentrated growth of Muncie is.
Yeah.
So that's why these are amazing maps, especially in the terms of the urban planning and context.
Yeah, and a big boom of Central European immigration happening in the state of Indiana as well. So yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So as we kind of go into this, I just want you to take a look up at this close-up of Muncie from 1883. I've zoomed in now to the courthouse square. And so what we would call this then is really the downtown, the built-up area, which is very common to the early development patterns, especially in the Midwest region. You get the courthouse in the center, and then the business district kind of surrounds it. Probably got a good deal of neoclassical, Italian commercial, commercial Italianates in there. And then what I want you to take a look at too is the building materials. So you're going to see that there are a lot of pink, right, which we know is brick. There is some yellow in there to indicate wood frame. There's even a little bit of blue for stone. But the majority of these buildings are really, really close together, especially if you look at the south block along Main Street. And they're all pink, and they probably all share parting walls. So when we think about why this area looks this way, maybe we look at it today, we might ask ourselves, why brick? Why not wood frame? Well, one, because wood frame was probably cheaper. It was cheaper. One is that they all share parting walls. So if there's a fire and you've got wood frame, and one building catches on fire, it's like a matchbox. It's just going to all go up. So this was a better material. The other thing is that it was more expensive, but if there was anyone who could afford to build in brick, it was going to be the business owners, right? And they wanted to have that, usually that, more classical appearance, a little bit more high style to them, because they were a business. And many times actually you'll find, and this is still common to find these kinds of buildings, an entire wood frame building, only the facade is brick, just because they wanted the front part to look good to the public. But then just take a look at some of the uses here, and then kind of look at what Muncie looks like today. They used to have an opera house. I mean, if you look here in this bottom right corner of Main Street, there's the Weiser Grand Opera House, no longer in existence. Taking a look at some of the uses here, you can actually see over on the right that where it says GRO, that's grocery. GEN.S, that's a general store. HRWR, hardware store. So you're really seeing what was going on in these buildings. And you can go and look at the maps today, see what still exists using like Google Maps, and then kind of ask yourself, well, why does it look that way today? And go, well, it was a grocery store. That explains it. That's maybe why I see those old, some of the paint, maybe the advertisements on the side can sometimes still be there. Some of the storefronts can still have indicators on them. So a picture really is worth more than 1,000 words. So one of the things I kind of go through here is just to give you guys an example of how these maps can help you with interpretation. In this example that I'm going to use, I'm going to go through the same city block throughout the years that we have Sanborn Maps, and I want you to see how transportation is an influence for the built environment. So this city block is north of the courthouse. It's 1883. And as you can see, as I mentioned before, there's multiple stables in the backyards. And there's a blacksmith shop that's actually on Gilbert Street. And that blacksmith shop is the one that's in stone with the arrow right here. And then we do have a jail, which is built out of brick with a 2-story hyphen attachment to a 2-story dwelling. So you're going to learn really quickly, especially in the Midwest region, that the sheriff's house was common to have it attached to the jail. because the sheriff would actually live in the house where they would reside as part of their job, and then they could tend to the prisoners in the jail. And of course, this was very, very close to the courthouse, just north of it, so that when it came time to trial, they could just go out and walk the prisoner down. These are very, very common for historic buildings. Many of them have been saved, some have not, some are in the process of being saved, which you'll learn as you go through and learn more about preservation and urban planning. So the same city block is now in 1902. You can still see some of the stables are remaining. The livery and a carriage house has now replaced the blacksmith shop, and a harness and a bicycle shop with a carriage repository has now replaced the millinery and an office. Just take a quick look here. I'm just going to go back. Wood frame primarily, some stone, some brick. Would you even recognize this block for what it is? And remember, that's that time period for the Industrial Revolution. We went from 7 sheets to over 37 sheets of documentation. A lot of activity.
Massive growth.
Massive growth and building in brick. Absolutely. So moving forward to 1911, and just so you know, if you're going to be using the Muncie maps for Delaware County, these years that I'm showing you are the available map years, which we'll go into that later. So by 1911, the same city block north of the courthouse, there's only one remaining stable. The livery is still intact. However, the harness and the bicycle shop has been replaced with implements and a few other shops, and there's now a Christian Science church. But the Delaware County Jail is still there. You can still see that, but it's still continual growth and changing, and the building material is changing. Also, take a quick look there. You can also see the cottage steam laundry. Curious to see what that looks like today for that area. Now, moving forward from 1911 to 1954, because that's the big gap. That's the big gap that Delaware County faces. We have about 40 years where there was no documentation. So I am told that there's a rumor that there is a 1930-ish map somewhere out there for Muncie that I've got to get my hands on, but nobody else seems to have it. But the rumor is there is one in existence. But this is where it really hurts in terms of understanding the development of an area when you get a 40-year gap where you can't see anything. But at this point in time, it's the same exact city block, and we see extreme amounts of differences on the built environment. And this is all impacted because of the transportation. So to where the livery stable was in the upper right-hand corner is now an auto body shop. And the all important, we have to make room for these automobiles. So now half of that block is a parking lot, right? So that's a real big impact. And then if you look in the lower left-hand corner, you're actually going to see that now we have a filling station and a tire sales and service. So huge, huge impact, all because of the lifespan of switching from horses, bicycles, all the way to automobiles. And then the Delaware County Jail has now been rebuilt. The old historic sheriff's residence was torn down, and a new jail made out of stone was constructed. So, and also here's another auto service that's in brown, which means it's fireproof building. Huge impact there. Now, one thing I want to quickly point out is if you can see this little line that looks like somebody cut out a piece of paper and maybe pasted it on top. I usually ask, does anybody know what that means? And what that actually means is shortcut. So we took the previous 1911 map, or 1930 if that one does exist, and we cut out and documented only the portions that changed, because we wanted to save money and we wanted to only document relevant changes. So you'll actually be able, well, you shouldn't do this, but you can actually, and some people have, they'll go in, they can actually peel back some of the layers. You can actually see what was under there prior to the addition. So if you ever see this, just know they're using the map year prior to this, and they're only pasting on changes that occurred for that one particular section for that map. So how can you access these amazing maps? Well, if you are dealing with Delaware County, the physical maps are located in Bracken Library and Archives and Special Collections, room 210. However, with COVID-19 and also with the advance of digitizing collections, you will be very unlikely to even need to go there, because any map year that you see here in red has been digitized and is available online on the digital media repository. Not only is it visible online, but we also have an interactive ArcGIS application that I can give, you know, all the information for to Lauren. I'll give you a handout. And basically you go to this application, you put in the address or the area that you're looking for, and it will layer every single one of these map years so that you can very pointedly see very clearly if it was documented, and you can select that layer or deselect that layer, and you can just toggle through the years, and you don't have to worry about figuring out what sheet number it's on. It'll automatically go there for you. So that's a great application. We do have a ProQuest subscription that you have access to as Ball State students. This will also be on the handout, and this will give you a link so that you can access Indiana, Ohio, and Kentucky maps. However, these are all black and white, so keep that in mind. The Library of Congress has some excellent maps for the United States as a whole. They have an amazing interface for their collection, and it is beyond Muncie, it's beyond Indiana, it is United States, Canada, and Mexico. The only thing that you have to be cautious of with the Library of Congress is that they will only usually have the early maps. But depending on your area and that you're documenting and the time period of growth, you could actually get quite a number of maps for it. And then the University of Indiana, they have a digital porthole. They have pretty much every Sanborn map for all of Indiana. The good thing about them, once you learn how to use their platform, and if you have any problems with this, I usually meet, I frequently will meet with students to teach you where to find your maps at and give you all the options, because the interface for the University of Indiana is a little complicated, but you can put in an address and it will pull every map that it has for that area. And then the best part is, on the handouts I give you is an email address. So they will actually digitize and scan for you free of charge copies that are still in copyright and email them to you.
Ah, okay. Great.
My problem is if you wait too long and say a class of 100 is trying to get them from the map person there, they won't be able to keep up with your request, and it might take some time, and you might not get them in time to complete your assignment. So there's a number of different options for you depending on where your map is. So that's all I've got for Sanborn Maps. Love them, learn them.
Yeah.
They will help you so much. They're amazing. If you're like me, you'll fall in love with them. They're one of my favorite resources for doing historic research and context. They can feed so much info, and they're so detailed, and really there are only, for the most part, with the exception of some rare exceptions, they're one of our only visual views into the past.
Yes.
So really enjoy using them. They'll be very helpful. Lauren can give you my information if you have an assignment that's tagged around this. I'm happy. Just tell me what your area is, what your goal of the assignment is, and I will tell you exactly where you can find your maps at, as well as other resources depending upon the assignment that you're given.
Yeah, we're studying the area basically from my neighborhood, the 500 block of West Charles, all the way to the 500 block of East Charles, basically with Walnut Street in between. So going from the old West End all the way into the East Central neighborhood. And even just in that short segment, it goes through 2 residential neighborhoods. It touches industrial uses, it touches all the commercial uses, and even all the social services that are very close to Madison Street and Charles there. So there's already 4, 5, or 6 zones, plus Ivy Tech is now out located, is now a neighbor. So there's a lot of things happening on Charles Street just in the past 3 years. And to have this window to history is particularly special for me as a Charles Street resident. I learned things about my neighborhood from looking at the Sanborn map that I didn't even know existed. I didn't know there was a church 50 feet away from where I live. I didn't know that there were so many livery stables in the neighborhood. But it gives an incredible picture to how people were living in the old West End in 1910, 1912, when the house that I live in was built. There were servants' quarters. There were what we call granny flats today, were typically servants' flats. And where people park their cars in the neighborhood now, you can still see the foundation blocks from when the livery stable was in place and the horses were there. So looking at these particular documents added to the experience of the neighborhood, you put those two things together, it provides an incredible mental picture for how people lived and why the neighborhood is the way it is for students. So thank you so much for this and helping open this resource to our students. Thank you very much, Rebecca, for your time.
You're very welcome, and feel free, like I said, reach out. I love these maps, and I'm happy to help you to acquire them and to help you to understand how to use them and interpret them. So that's what I'm here for. So thank you, Lauren, for asking me to speak today.
Thank you. Thank you. And we'll end the recording in 3, 2, 1.